Kia ora koutou, travelling up to the North Island for a change. Lucky to be presenting on this project, which is part of a broader project funded by MB to assess ecological impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle on our ecosystem, species and conservation infrastructure. So you probably all remember last year, Cyclone Gabrielle. Here's a satellite view from the 13th of February. And you can see impacting much of the North Island, causing a huge amount of damage. And then in terms of where that damage occurred, this sort of map by Dragonfly, you can see large amount of damage sort of on the east coast area of the North Island and also other areas as well. But we're going to focus today on the Braided Rivers in the Napier region. Before I get into that, just a quick highlight that cyclones are moving polewards and also more frequently of high intensity. And so this sort of suggests that New Zealand is going to see more cyclones in the future and that they're going to be stronger. So this is going to be a recurring problem. We sort of need to start thinking about, well, what ecosystems are most at risk, what species are most at risk, and then we can actually put some policies into place to try and protect them better. So there's sort of four major types of cyclone damage. These are some images that we've taken as part of the broader project. The main one people think of for cyclones is often wind, and this causes, blowdown of forests. So this is a picture from Aotearoa Forest in the Bay of Plenty. But we found that this wasn't actually a major problem with Cyclone Gabrielle. Erosion was one of the main problems. This is from Opawahi Kiwi Crash in the Hawke's Bay. Well, they had 2 breaches of their predator-proof fence there and had incursions of multiple pest species, cats, rats, stoats, sheep, as you can see. I don't know if they're a pest. And then, that erosion, that sediment flows down into the waterways, which become inundated. So flooding is another effect. This is some kahikatea forest in the Gisborne region. Got flooded, sediment deposited, and you can see it's dying. So this is another part of the project that I'll talk about in other talks. And then finally, that sedimentation gets deposited out to sea and also in the Braided Rivers. So this is the Ngārororo River, one of the focal rivers from the study today. So those are the 4 main types of damage. But because New Zealand hasn't had frequent cyclones, at least compared to other parts of the world, almost nothing is known about their impacts on ecosystems. This paper, Lin et al. In 2020, they managed to collate a grand total of 4 publications from New Zealand that had assessed cyclone impacts. So this was a tragic but welcome opportunity to start to understand these extreme weather events better. Globally, we do have somewhat of a decent understanding of cyclone impacts on forests and marine ecosystems especially. But what we really don't know is about cyclone impacts on animals and also uncommon ecosystems. And so that's where our braided rivers come in. Not only are they uncommon in New Zealand, but also globally. And then finally, while we sort of look often at direct impacts of cyclones, we often don't think about the indirect impacts. And so this might include things like changes in habitat having flow-on and indirect effects on the abundance and distribution of animal communities. And animals are often also not being studied with cyclones. So that brings me to the project that I've been involved in. This was making use of some really great long-term monitoring that's been done in the Hawke's Bay region through multiple rivers and catchments. So there was 3 years of pre-cyclone data and surveys across a large number, I think about 290 kilometres of river that were covered. And so we were able to leverage that data and use that as a pre-cyclone baseline to effectively check and see how the cyclone impacted the communities in these rivers. A little bit about Hawke's Bay's Braided Rivers, you may already know about it. But basically, there's been more than 70 bird species recorded from the Hawke's Bay Braided Rivers. 47 of those are native, and they're a stronghold for several species. So these numbers might not be, there's a plus minus around all of them, but essentially 13% of the global population of banded dotterel found on Hawke's Bay's Braided Rivers. 50% of our national population of black-fronted dotterel, it's a real stronghold for that species. 5% of the national population of pied stilt, and it's also these rivers are the only North Island breeding population for tōrea. So pretty special ecosystems. So with this project we had a couple of main research objectives. The first one was to quantify the impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle on the braided river habitat and the shorebirds. And then secondly, I thought it would be interesting to try to explore the relationships between the river habitat structure and the changes in that river habitat and shorebird density and the changes in shorebird density pre and post cyclone. So yeah, as I mentioned already, we made use of 3 years worth of pre-cyclone survey data, and this was across 3 catchments. So the really large Tukituki catchment. We also broke this down into sort of 10 rivers, but I'm only going to avoid complicating things, I'm just going to present results at the catchment scale today. Yeah, the Aotearoa and the Tutaikuri as well. So those are the 3 catchments. And 3 pre-cyclone surveys done 2019 through to 2021. And then this was repeated in 2023. So yeah, 292 kilometres of river was surveyed, and this was broken up into 353 sections. So these are these different blue and yellow sections. And those sections varied in length, so 220 to over 220 metres to over 2 kilometres long. The reason for this is because these are the sections that are considered as like management parcels by the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. So this is where they design gravel extraction and stuff like that. So by using predetermined sections, we're able to link up with a whole lot of management that's done in the system as well. And so in each section, we completed bird censuses, so not just surveys, but literally trying to capture every bird in each segment. And then also vegetation cover was quantified and substrate composition. So a little bit more detail about those methods. For the bird census, depending on the size of each section and the width of it, basically, we had teams of 1 to 6 observers, and they would walk this zigzag pattern up the riverbed or down the riverbed. And the goal there was basically to try to observe all parts of the river in detail to within a distance of, say, 50 metres. Oftentimes it was less than 50 metres, but the goal was to try to census every bird and not miss any black-fronted dotterels in the little backwaters, or try and make sure you're capturing as much as possible anyway. And so, yeah, this would give us cumulative counts for all bird species, but for today, I'm just focusing on the results for 4 of the key native shorebirds that I talked about earlier. But yeah, we have the entire community that could also be analysed as well. But I think these are the more sort of braided river specialists that we're interested in. Vegetation and substrate sampling was done every 200 metres within each section. So at 0 metres, 200 metres, and so on, all the way up to, I guess, when you had 2 kilometre sections, you'd get a lot of data. So yeah, you'd stand at a point and look 50 metres below you, downstream, 50 metres upstream, and basically just as quick as you can, because it's a lot of data, try and quantify percent cover of vegetation greater than 5 centimetres tall. So this was mostly, as I'm sure you're aware, invasive weeds like tree lupin, as you can see in the figure. Percent cover of different substrate size classes. So there was 7 substrate size classes. I won't bore you with the details of the sizes of each one, but that ranged from silt, really fine silt, all the way through to bedrock and boulders. And same method, just looking 50 metres ahead, 50 metres behind, and trying to give a rough estimate as you can of those different size classes. And then you'd average that within each river section, so you'd get an idea of substrate, composition, and vegetation cover. So I think on to results. So remembering the first objective was to try and quantify impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle on habitat and shorebirds. Kicking things off with vegetation cover. Out of those 292 sections that were surveyed pre and post cyclone, cover declined in 96% of those sections. So as you'd expect, severe flooding of the rivers washed away a lot of the vegetation. What we found consistently for vegetation, substrate cover, and the birds, as you'll see, is that the strength of these impacts depended on the catchment. You're going to see a bunch of these figures, so I'll walk you through the first one and then it should be self-evident from then on. Light grey is pre-cyclone numbers, dark grey is comparing that post-cyclone, and we've got 3 different catchments, Aotearoa, Tukituki, and Tutaikuri. Lowercase letters just mean that they were statistically different in the model, in the contrasts, right? So we saw declines in all 3 catchments for vegetation cover, but the strength of that decline depended on the catchment. So less of a decline in vegetation cover in the Aotearoa compared to the Tukituki and the Tutaikuri. But even in the short time between the cyclone and when we did the survey, so about 6 months, we were already seeing rapid reinvasion occurring across the board. So it's not going to take long, a year or 2 until you see, I think, those vegetation cover levels reaching similar amounts again, pending more flooding. With substrate is where it got interesting, and again, probably what you would expect to see, right? So this figure shows the composition of substrate in those 3 different catchments. The warmer colours up the top represent your finer scale substrates, and your darker colours, cooler colours down the bottom are your more coarse substrates. And so you can see sort of these rivers pre-cyclone were mostly dominated by these intermediate size classes or medium size classes, the greens and the blue, gravel, pebbles, cobble. But post-cyclone, we see a lot more sediment, so silt, the pink, increasing across the board, and same with sand, especially in the Tutaikuri. So yeah, a shift towards more fine substrate in these rivers. And when we look at this for individual substrate classes, so just a couple of examples, with silt we see massive increases in the Naruroro and also smaller increases in silt cover in the Tukituki and the Tutaikuri. And then if we shift to cobble, so that's the blue here, we see cobble has declined in the Tukituki and the Tutaikuri, but not the Naruroro. So again, there's some slight catchment level differences going on as well. But generally what we see is an increase in fine sediment deposited on those coarser substrates. So then what does that mean for the birds? And yeah, what did we see? What patterns did we see with the birds, right? So I've tried to make this as visual as possible, but there will also be some more dynamite plots with error bars, etc. But this is what it looked like pre-cyclone for banded dotterel. The size of each point is sort of representative of the density per hectare. And this is a consistent sort of scale across the figures. I've only shown it in the first one here. But you can see, widely distributed across the board, pre-cyclone. Post-cyclone, you can see almost entirely disappearing from the Tutaikuri. And also, there's less dots and maybe even a redistribution with sort of increased density in the upper reaches of the Tukituki. So yeah, this was just to sort of highlight, that's the Tutaikuri. You can see really quite a major difference. And when you sort of think about why, well, this is when I flew into Napier. This is what that section that I've highlighted looks like from the air. So yeah, lots of sediment deposition, probably not great habitat anymore for the banded dotterel. And then these are the numbers reflecting what you can sort of see in the map. Big decline in the Tutaikuri, reasonable decline in the Naruroro, and very little decline, but maybe a redistribution in the Tukituki. Black-fronted dotterel, pre-cyclone, this is what their distribution and density look like. Post-cyclone, almost gone, right? Very few left there, and maybe a redistribution, or maybe this, I need to check this data point, it seems really high. But you can see generally there's been a massive decline again in black-fronted dotterel, so 27% decline compared to the average pre-cyclone numbers. And for this species, it was all three catchments that were affected. Again, there was a significant interaction, so the amount of decline did differ among the catchments, but all three of them did see a decrease. Poaka, pied stilt, what's the story there? You can see the kind of in small numbers everywhere in those lower catchments, and again, decent numbers in the lower Tutaikuri. With the cyclone, there's been an 18% decline in average numbers, and also looks like, again, a redistribution into the upper areas of the Tukituki. So yeah, numbers decline, and they seem to be moving. And in this case, it was the Tutaikuri again, which was the worst affected, seeing the biggest declines of almost 50% in pied stilt numbers, while Naruroro and Tukituki also saw declines, but much smaller. tōrea, South Island pied oystercatcher, the only breeding population in the North Island. You can see, they're in low numbers throughout the Naruroro and the Tukituki, with a few scattered in the Tutaikuri, before the cyclone anyway. This is post-cyclone, so not great. We probably saw, I think, about 13 individuals, and I think only one that we sort of determined was breeding, one paired breeding post-cyclone. So yeah, they almost disappeared. 73% decline. So Tutaikuri totally gone, Tukituki almost gone, and the Naruroro population halved. So onto the second set of results, a bit more preliminary and speculative, trying to work with some complex data sets, but yeah, hopefully trying to draw some links between habitat change and bird density change as well. So that's the goal of this part. So I think it's almost like a given, or one of those bits of institutional knowledge, that shorebird abundance on braided rivers depends on vegetation cover, right? But I haven't been able to find a heap of data or published studies that sort of support this. So I think we've got some nice evidence here that shorebird abundance was highest when vegetation cover was low, And we saw this was consistent for multiple species. Banded dotterel, black-fronted dotterel, and pied stilt all seemed to prefer low vegetation cover relative to high vegetation cover. And when we try to look at how changes in vegetation cover mapped against changes in shorebird density, we do start to see some patterns emerge, but statistically they're not non-significant. So I think there's a bit of playing around to do with these models, because there's some strong autocorrelation between substrate types or substrate classes. But essentially what these figures are showing is that you've got change in percent vegetation cover on the x-axis. So this means, we saw a large decrease in vegetation cover through to no change in vegetation cover, or increased vegetation cover if you go way to the right. And then this is on the y-axis is change in bird density. So increased bird density up the top, declines in bird density on the bottom. And so you're seeing river sections with the greater post-cyclone decreases in vegetation. So those sections on this side of the figures tended to have the larger increases in shorebird density. Yeah, so this was non-significant for some species, but you can sort of see that there is a somewhat consistent trend emerging there. Substrate composition, a bit more complicated, as I sort of alluded to. 7 different size classes to pick through. Tried to combine those into fine, medium, and coarse. I'm not sure it's still really working, but what we're seeing is that there seems to be some relationships with fine and medium substrate cover. So black-fronted dotterel density per hectare and pied stilt density per hectare seems to increase with increasing medium substrate cover. And I'm not sure I fully believe this result from my model at this stage, but suggested that banded dotterel abundance was increasing with fine substrate cover, but it doesn't seem to really match up with what the raw data suggests. So I think there's still some work to do with the modelling with substrate. And then if we look at these same sort of figures, looking at change in percent substrate cover and change in bird density, we again see similar patterns across multiple species emerging. So river sections that saw the greatest declines in fine substrate, so these on the left, also saw the greatest increases in banded dotterel and cypo density. So this sort of suggests that the segments or sections of river that received a lot of fine sediment saw declines in the shorebirds, and those that saw less in terms of more fine sediment being put in there saw the greatest increases in bird density. And then we see the opposite for medium substrate cover. So sites where we saw, or sections where we saw medium substrate cover increasing, was where we saw the greatest changes in cypo density, or greatest increases in cypo density. So yeah, I think there's still a bit of disentangling of these relationships to do, but it should hopefully provide some good evidence for how we link birds with habitat. So just quick sum up of the key findings. The impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle depended on the catchment that was being studied. But in general, we can take away that Cyclone Gabrielle reduced vegetation cover in these braided rivers and increased fine substrate, and that shorebird species declined as a result of Cyclone Gabrielle by 18 to 73% across all catchments. But again, this depended on the catchment that they were in. And we're sort of starting to pull out some tentative links between habitat composition and shorebird density. And I think this is where we might have management implications for, projects like gravel extraction and where gravel extraction occurs, and how silt and sediments dealt with in the riverbeds. A couple of more general points before I wrap up. I think that this project and the broader project are starting to point towards its uncommon ecosystems and these range restricted species that are especially at risk from extreme weather events. And finally, this really highlights the value of robust continuous monitoring data. So this wouldn't have been possible if Hawke's Bay Regional Council hadn't decided to do 3 years worth of shorebird censuses or bird censuses on their riverbeds. They didn't know there was going to be a cyclone, but that allowed the opportunity to actually quantify the impacts of the cyclone, which is something that we've not really done before in New Zealand. So just 3 more outstanding questions that I think have, we always end up with more questions than answers. So where did these birds go? We don't think that the banded dotterels, perished in the storm. They can fly, right? And they were done breeding, so they probably just moved elsewhere. But where have they moved this this particular breeding season, we're not sure. Hopefully, we might be able to pick that out from looking at Birds NZ data, if there's been big bumps elsewhere in neighbouring regions, for example. But that might be a tricky question to answer with the available data. Secondly, we want to know, do food resources play a role? So is it that the sediment's choking everything in the stream and that food's no longer in the rivers and the food's no longer there? So we're hoping to pair this with macroinvertebrate surveys that the freshwater team at HBRC has been doing. And then finally, I think the key question that everyone would want to know is, well, are these populations going to recover and how long that's going to take? So I think this points towards the need for follow-up surveys in the coming years to sort of see if these numbers are bouncing back. And yeah, big acknowledgements. It takes a huge field team to collect all these data, and also to the funding agencies that help make this possible. And yeah, happy to take any questions if we have time. Yeah, thanks, Angus. I totally agree. I think it's, the sediment might be reducing the available breeding habitat. That might be one thing, but it probably also has a huge impact on their food supply. So yeah, that's why we're hoping to get some data from Hawke's Bay Regional Council that sort of speaks to that. There's a limited number of sites that are actually within the Braided Rivers, so it'll be a pretty coarse approach, but we might, and we don't even necessarily know exactly what they feed on, but we might be able to see, there's been a massive drop in macroinvertebrates, and that might be something that we could sort of speculate about. I think there's strong appetite to do it. It's just going to be finding the funding. So it's been funded through the Hawke's Bay asset management team, which I think has a lot to do with gravel extraction. So yeah, there's some leverage there that we need to work on to get the funding. But yeah, there's definitely appetite from within the council and other groups to keep it going. Yeah, you make a good point, and maybe we need to think about splitting those data sets into pre-cyclone and post-cyclone to look at those relationships.